Hi everyone, how's everyone doing?
Hi, Evelyn. Everybody's great. All right. We're almost on the hour. So yeah, go ahead. You can start your session. Thank you so much for
Perfect.
contributing.
Thank you very much for having me. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And welcome to India Cloud Security Summit 2025. So it's been a long day for some of you. It's only 1 o'clock where I am, so I'm logging in from Ireland, so it's not too bad. But thanks for pulling through all the sessions and joining me here. So again, make sure that you stay until the end. There are some exciting prizes to win, so make sure that you listen carefully because some of the questions that will be asked will be from the presentation. So my presentation today is around how to secure your M365 tenant like a boss with some admin tips that hopefully you will thank me for. When it comes to myself, my name is Ewelina Paczkowska. I'm a solution architect at a company called Threadscape. I'm also a creator of Welka's World blog, where I post about stuff relating to anything kind of with that Microsoft security banner on it, but specifically around identity and access and Microsoft Purview. I'm also a Microsoft Purview Community Champion for 2025, and I do co-organize Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance User Group with my two colleagues from Threadscape, Rue Campbell and William Francelet as well. So you can find me on my social media, you can find me on my blog as well, and if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just let me know. So the agenda for today is to get the latest advice for an evergreen service. So Microsoft being Microsoft, nothing stays still. So I'm here to give you some of the lessons from the field. There are some no nonsense, actionable tips that you will be able to take away with yourself. So there will be 20 of those tips that you can apply to your own environments. And all those tips will be based on two main concepts, which are zero trust and defense in depth as well. So first of all, and I know some of the other people during this conference have already touched on the zero trust and the defense in depth, but just to kind of repeat that. So zero trust approach is based on those three main concepts where you never trust, always verify. So it kind of flips that old trust but verify model on its head. It's all about a no implicit trust and continuous verification as well. Whereas the defense in depth approach, so this is focused on the multiple layers of protection. So when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to think about that defense in depth, focusing on identity, your devices, your applications, network data, infrastructure. Okay, so it's all about kind of building that layered resilience. So how do they kind of come together, those two concepts of defense in depth and zero trust? Well, it's all about verifying things explicitly, using the principle of least privilege, and assuming breach. As someone that works with Purview quite a lot, I always hear from customers that would come out and reach out to us and ask to put in maybe sensitivity labels in place or maybe data loss prevention and so on. But when we actually look at their tenancy, it's become very evident that they're not actually protecting their first line of defense, which is something that you should be protecting first, because even if you've got a sensitivity labels in place with encryption, what good are they actually if you're not protecting your devices or you're not protecting your users, right? So your first line of defense is going to be based on protecting identities and devices. So you'll be touching on products and solutions from within Entra ID, Intune, Defender XDR, and then specific object permissions relating to Teams, SharePoint, and Exchange. So you kind of have to think about your tenancy as some sort of a castle or a fortress, right? So you need to protect it from all different sides, and you cannot essentially protect your data without securing your identities and devices first. So think about all those different types of shields that you can use within your tenant. And I always say that an attacker's goal at the end of the day is almost always data. So it's the data they are essentially are after. So the easiest way to get it, so to get in and get that data is by compromising your identity. So that's why, in my view, identity security is also data security as well. So protect your identity, and then you're protecting that data behind it as well. So without further ado, here are my 20 admin tips for you. So tip number 1 is to separate your standard accounts from admin accounts, right? So your administrator accounts are your crown jewels, so you need to treat them and protect them accordingly as well. The reason behind separating your standard account that you use for daily activities, sending emails, connecting with people via Teams chat and so on, is that you don't want to have any lateral movement if your account that is an administrative account, if it's being synchronized from on-prem up to the cloud, then it's always that risk of lateral movement. So if they compromise you within your on-prem environment, there's a higher risk of you also getting compromised within your cloud environment as well. So ideally, there should be a separate account from your day-to-day business activities and a separate account, like an admin.johnblogs type of a thing, for your admin tasks only. When it comes to your administrative accounts, you can use the non-mailbox admin accounts, but also enforce some licenses for Microsoft Purview or Entra ID, P1, P2, that type of a thing, right? For that extra layer of protection. And you can, of course, set up different alerting in place. You can use the plus addressing within the properties of your users' accounts to make sure that you're not actually missing any emails that would be sent to your admin accounts as well. And you should always follow that least privilege principle and just-in-time access. So if you're licensed for something like a privilege identity management, then you should definitely use it. And this is an example here. So let's say within your Entra ID, when you look at the list of users, so in this specific scenario, let's say Adele is my admin user. So she would have a separate account for her day-to-day activities. And then for any admin tasks that she would need to carry out within Entra ID or whatever portal it might be, then she would be logging in from her Azure admin Adele account that wouldn't be synchronized from on-premises. So tip number 2 is to have break glass, or what we call emergency access accounts, in place as well. So the latest advice on it is to make sure that you at least have 2 break glass accounts in place, so that when you are stuck, you cannot get in. Maybe your PIM is not working or something of that sort. This is your way to get access into your tenancy. So you can store the credentials very securely with like an offline password manager or a secure vault, but you should take it even a step further and secure these accounts with phish-resistant authentication, such as using the physical FIDO2 keys that wouldn't be linked to any shape or form to a specific device or a specific user. So let's say if you've got an administrator within your tenant or within your organization and they have that FIDO2 key, but then they leave the organization, well, then someone else can take over that physical device as well. If you were to set up a passkey, let's say on an iPhone or an Android, the minute that someone leaves the organization or the minute that someone changes their phone, that authentication method is then gone. And then, of course, you would need to exclude break glass accounts from some necessary conditional access policies, just so you don't lock yourself out. But you still want to ensure that you do have some conditional access policies restricting that access, maybe from specific IP addresses, specific countries, maybe specific devices, and so on. So they're still protected, and that access is still being a little bit restricted as well. And you should be setting up some additional alerting, so you can have a log analytics workspace in place that will let you know when someone is signing into that break glass account, just to make sure that there is no kind of unapproved access going on within the environment. And as an example, again, you don't need to make those break glass account names obvious. You can make them something different, use like a code name or whatever, but they also shouldn't be synced from your on-prem environment back to the cloud. And you should be using something like YubiKeys or any type of a FIDO2 key as your authentication method for them. And of course, you'll be applying some conditional access policies to those specific accounts as well. So for example, again, blocking some legacy authentication, enforcing MFA, and allowing access from specific locations and so on. You kind of get the idea. So on to tip number 3, which is to block users from starting Microsoft trials, right? So you don't really want the user firing up a random trial and introducing that idea of shadow IT within your tenant into your kind of carefully curated ecosystem. So you should be disabling the user's ability to start the organization-wide trials. So this is something that would be kind of enabled by default, and you can change it easily within the main Microsoft 365 admin center. So how would you go about doing that? Well, if you jump into the M365 admin center, you go over to your settings or org settings and then user own apps and services, and you've got a specific sub setting in here that says starting trials on behalf of your organization, and just make sure that this is disabled. Okay, so on to tip number 4, which is to block self-service license purchases. So let's say maybe you're holding off on Microsoft 365 Copilot licenses for now. Well, great, because you might not be ready yet. You might not have all the preventative measures in place to make sure that you're confident enough to finally kind of flip that switch. But your users might not even be thinking that. And because they have that ability to self-purchase, let's say the Copilot license or whatever license they would like, they have that option unless you explicitly disable that for them. So they can essentially just self-purchase that. And this is something that you can turn off either within the GUI of the portal or via PowerShell. However, you can disable this for the current SKUs or the current subscriptions that you might have in place. So this is something that you would need to either automate or periodically check, because let's say if we jump into the portal, so this is how you would go about disabling this specific option. So within the M365 admin center, if you go to settings, org settings, and then you click into the self-service trials and purchases, those self-service settings are correlating to specific SKUs or types of subscriptions. So you do it per subscription, okay, and not a per user or per tenant or anything like that. You can then just decide whether this is something that would be allowed or disallowed for a specific subscription. However, let's say maybe you don't have Copilot license in place right now, but you're thinking of buying some next month, right? So let's say you disable those options today. Well, you will need to go back and disable the option for Copilot once you add it into your tenancy as well. So ideally, you would want to automate it, but a periodic check is also really, really important as well. Okay. Tip number 4 is to block the self-service Copilot plugins and integrated applications. So as we all know, those Copilot or Gen AI agents are becoming more and more popular. So this kind of creates that potential for shadow AI plugins. So ideally, you would want to limit the user installed plugins to only trusted applications or just disable that option altogether. And this is something that, again, is enabled by default. So you have to think about that secure by default or secure by design initiatives from Microsoft. So they are constantly kind of actively working on it. But, there are still a bunch of different settings within those M365 tenants that are enabled by default when realistically they should be disabled. So this is just another example of them. So how you would go about doing that? Well, again, within that M365 admin center, if you jump into settings and then integrated applications, you go over to the available applications tab, and then you filter the list of those applications by the host products, which host then Copilot. And over here, you've got a couple of different options, right? So at the moment, in all the tenants, there are 87 different applications that will be available to host those Copilot agents. But of course, that list might grow. So it's another one of those settings where you need to check it periodically just to make sure that any additional applications that will be added after you make that change, that they would also be covered and curated properly in your organization. So over here, it's not just a case of either enabling that or disabling that for all the users. You also have a little bit more granularity where you can maybe enable that only for a specific group of people within your environment and disable that for the rest of the organization. So you can see that within that highlighted area around that availability status, where for some of those applications, it says no users in the organizations can install. Then we've got an option for all users in the organization can install. And then we've got the last one at the bottom that says specific users in the organization can install. So again, gives you a little bit of more granularity. But again, this is one of those periodic checks that will need to happen periodically, just to make sure that you stay on top of those applications and agents that might be being added to your tenant. Okay. So tip number 6 is to control the user app consent. So essentially allowing your users, your standard users, so we're not talking about your admin users here, but your standard users, to grant app permissions to their data is basically like asking for trouble, right? Especially if that application wasn't vetted by you and your organization. So ideally, you would want to disable the default app consent for your standard users. You can, of course, introduce something like an approval workflow for any third-party applications that will be accessing your data, where an administrator can then make a decision on case-by-case basis whether an application should be allowed or not. So how you would go about checking that? So again, either within the Entra Admin Center or the Azure Admin Center. If you go over to your applications and then enterprise applications, you've got 2 separate options in here. So the top one is just around the user consent settings. So ideally, again, the user consent for applications should be set to do not allow user consent. Unless maybe you've got some specific applications that you do want to allow, then you can use allow user consent for applications where you can granularly kind of add those permissions for selected applications as well. And then, of course, at the bottom, we've got the options for the admin consent settings, where you can nominate your specific kind of reviewers within the organization. So these are your administrators that will be making a decision on a case-by-case basis whether an application should be added and should be approved or not. And so you can set up your email notifications in here and how long after someone requests that specific approval, how long will that access be active for, and whether that notification will then expire after a period of kind of a number of days or a month or whatever it might be within your specific case. Okay, so tip number 7 is to use the most restrictive guest user account settings. So again, by default, it's not that secure after all, because guests can enumerate users and groups, so they get access to see your user properties, kind of spook around your organization. So you can limit that guest user access to only the necessary files and applications as well, to avoid that accidental data leak. But of course, this is something that you should be regularly auditing and checking as well. So how would you go about changing that or looking at your current settings? So again, if you jump over to the Entra Admin Center, you go over to the external identities and then external collaboration settings. Within here, you've got the guest user access settings. So in most of the organizations, I think the default kind of one is the middle option. So guest users have limited access to properties and memberships of directory objects, but you should be asking yourself why they even need that level of permissions. They're only signing into your tenancy. They're not a full member account. So they should be utilizing that most restrictive setting in here as well. Okay, on to the next one. So this is something that I've recently blogged about as well. So it's really important to use your company branding and data privacy settings as well. So you can kind of help your end users spot phishing by making legit login pages that are clearly branded with your company logo, and maybe something that it would be very kind of easy to spot. So think about setting your background sign-in image as, I don't know, like a pink flamingo, a smiley cow, a giant duck, that kind of a thing. Something really, really obvious to spot, so that you can train your users that if they type in their username and before they type in their password, they're welcomed by your branding colors, you know, they're welcomed by the background image. You kind of train them to look out for specific things that they need to verify that they are there or they're not there before they can actually type in their credentials, just to make sure that they're not being like redirected to a page that is not genuine. So it's a subtle aid. It's not a kind of silver bullet type of a thing. It's really nice to have. Obviously, the hackers are getting more and more sophisticated. So there are tools such as Evil Jinx and so on that can put you through proxy and make that not genuine page kind of look genuine. However, you know, you would still be able to eliminate at least some percentage of those attacks as well. So how would you go about setting that up? So again, within the Entra Admin Center, you've got a company branding setting under the user experiences, and you can go through all the tabs in here like basics, layout, header, footer, sign-in form, and so on. And you would have also access to modify your privacy settings, or alternatively, for the privacy settings, you can also jump into the main M365 admin center and look at the settings, org settings, and modify your data privacy settings in here as well. Pink Flamingo, yeah, Parav, yeah, that's it. That's a good idea as well. So in my case, just as an example, let's say I configured my corporate branding with my Welcas World, favicon and banner and so on. And then in the background, I just put a giant duck. So I really love ducks. So this is just something that I couldn't resist but to add. But yeah, this is something that would be easily spotted. So you can just train your users that if that giant duck is not there, well, they probably shouldn't be signing in. Okay, so tip number 9, do not use public M365 groups. So essentially, public groups allow visibility to all tenant members. Plus, you know, there's always that potential of data sprawl into co-pilots, in index corpus and so on. So even though your groups might be private, you can still add, let's say, people from outside of the organization to those groups as well. So again, it's just to prevent any accidental storage of sensitive information in those public groups. You can even take it a step further, and apart from just setting a group to private instead of public, you can apply a container sensitivity label to make sure that this cannot be changed and you have a full control over the files and information that might be sensitive, that might be shared within that group as well. So how would you go about checking those settings and how many groups you've got public at the moment and disabling that? Well, there are many different options how you can actually check it, but probably the easiest one is to just jump into the M365 admin center, go over to your teams and groups, active teams and group, and just export the list here and just filter that, let's say in Excel, by the privacy settings. So you can easily even look at the column, but of course, if you're dealing with a lot of different groups, will be harder to do within the GUI. And then just a note, I will be sharing these slides on my website and I will be posting about it on LinkedIn probably next week, but you will get access to all those scripts and all those screenshots as well. So don't worry if you cannot like take a screenshot of it right now or cannot take a note, because it will be all available on my website anyways. But this is how you would go about getting that list of public M365 groups via PowerShell and also changing that so then all of your public groups become private as well. Okay, so tip number 10 is to mark the devices as non-compliant when no policy applies. So by default, within the Intune Admin Center, when you've got a device that has no compliance policy assigned to it, it will be marked as compliant. So let's say if you think about maybe pushing out conditional access policies based on device compliance, and you say, okay, you cannot sign in unless your device is compliant or unless it's compliant and hybrid ID joined. Well, if you miss some device within the scope of your policy and they're marked as compliant rather than non-compliant, but let's say they're missing a TPM module or their antivirus software is not working properly on that device, they're still being able to get the authorization to sign in and use the applications. but their device might not actually be compliant. So what you should do, and again, this might be a big kind of business impact, so be careful with it. Run your reports before you go and change it, right? And then if you were to, let's say, enforce that compliance, device compliance via conditional access settings, make sure that you use the report only mode first and then just see what the impact would be. But if you were to check the current setting or change them, these are located within the Intune admin center. So you would jump into devices, compliance, and then there's a compliance settings tab in here. And it's that specific subsetting that says mark devices with no compliance policy assigned as. And as the default value, this is set to compliant, but ideally you would want to toggle that off and mark it as non-compliant. Okay, tip number 11 is to set up the DNS settings for all of your own domains, right? So email spoofing, unfortunately, is still a thing. So you should be preventing attackers from sending emails that may look like they come from your own domain. So the key thing here is that even if you own a domain that you're paying for, but maybe you're not doing anything with it, it's not being used to send any emails or anything like that, you should still be setting up your DNS settings. So I've attached a couple of different links to kind of help you with how to configure those DNS records based on that specific record type. You can, of course, reduce your phishing risk by preventing that email spoofing and so on. But for all of those DNS settings for the domains that you own that aren't being used for sending emails or receiving emails, these are the examples of the records that you can still put in place. So you might notice that for the DMARC, I'm recommending to set the record to reject all 100% of failures, so that PCT equals 100. This is kind of the default value, but I like to specifically call it out. So when I'm looking at it, I know exactly that it's a reject mode for 100% of those failures. And just another tip here for you as well. There is a great tool out there that most of people, I think, just use to check the DNS records for different domains, but they do actually have a kind of like a sub menu within there that you can use to generate your DMARC record. So if you're not sure how to structure that DMARC record, you can basically just answer a couple of different questions here. Like, for example, what is that mode, whether it's a monitor only, quarantine, reject, and so on, whether you want to get any reports to your email addresses, and what is that percentage of those emails that should be going through that mode. And then over on the right hand side, you've got that DNS record that was created for you. So you can take it and you can literally paste that information into the appropriate fields, into your cPanel details, wherever you're hosting your domains. Okay, so tip number 12 is do not let any email bypass spam filtering. So whitelisting domains might sound like a good idea, right? Until that domain gets compromised. So you might say that, okay, the domain is safe now, but who's to say that it's still going to be safe in a couple of months' time? So instead of kind of giving them that blind trust, you can use more granular settings or more nuanced rules. So what I'm recommending here is to use exchange transport rules with some additional checks, like the check for SPF, DKIM, DMARC for kind of better control. So how would you do that? Well, within the Exchange Admin Center, if you go over to the mail flow rules, you can add a rule or just edit an existing one. And instead of just saying, okay, apply this rule if my sender is this domain or this specific recipient, and then, bypass spam filtering, you can add additional check in here where you, for example, say, okay, the message headers would match specific text patterns so that the authentication results will check whether there's a SPF record present or a DKIM record present. So this is how you would go about kind of introducing those additional checks before something is kind of let through your spam filtering. And then the spam confidence level SCL -1 is essentially the same as bypass spam filtering option in here as well. Of course, if you've got any specific IP address ranges for those recipes or for those domains, you can still utilize that within your role. But instead of just saying, okay, bypass spam filtering for this specific domain or user, you can just use those additional options in here. Okay, tip number 13 is to block automatic email forwarding. So I suppose a very common hacker tactic is to compromise a user and then silently auto forward emails, right? So you should just immediately shut it down, right? Don't give them option to even be able to do it. So you can block automatic external forwarding by default and maybe allow exceptions when there's a real kind of business need for it. So how would you go about setting that up? Well, within the Exchange Admin Center, so similar to the last recommendation, you would go in and create your mail flow rule. So you can add a new one or just edit the existing one. And for example, in here, you can just say that if the sender is within your own organization, but the recipient is outside of your organization, based on the message properties that would include that auto forward, maybe just block that message. And you can, of course, add specific exclusions in here. Before you do it, maybe just go and run a report. So there's a report option within the Exchange Admin Center where you can actually check who's got the auto forward on. So that will give you a clear indication what you might be blocking or what you should be facilitating within that specific rule condition as well. Okay, so tip number 14 is to ensure the external storage providers in Outlook on the web are actually restricted. So again, by default, if someone was to sign into Outlook on the web and go over and save their attachments to the likes of Google Drive, Dropbox, Box, Personal OneDrive, they would be allowed to do so. So you can reduce the risk of data exfiltration by just limiting that to maybe your curated or approved cloud storage providers or just block them all. So you can just simply check it by just signing into Outlook on the web, going over to settings, email, and then attachments, and seeing the storage accounts options in here and whether you're able to save your attachments into any of them. In terms of how you would actually change that setting, how you would block it, you can do it via PowerShell. So again, the scripts will be available on my website as well. So you can check your current settings, and based on the name of your policy, then you will just need to modify the bottom part of that script where you actually either explicitly block all of them or you can just kind of do it on case-by-case basis as well for each one of the cloud storage providers too. Okay, so tip number 15 is to prevent guests from sharing content that they do not own. So you should be restricting your guests from sharing files that they haven't created, right? Again, they're only a guest within your environment, so they shouldn't have a full control over the files that were shared with them. And the default permissions kind of, let your guest send it to maybe their colleague or let them kind of save it or send it to their personal email domain. So you would ideally want to prevent it. So how would you go about doing that? If you jump into the SharePoint Admin Center, you go to Policies, Sharing, and then you scroll down. And within that more external sharing settings, you've got a sub-setting for allow guest users to share items they don't own. Well, if you just untick that and save it, that will just do it for you. Okay, tip number 16 is to use specific people as default sharing setting. So again, this is not something that is configured there within the tenancy for you by default. So again, this kind of goes back to that point that trust but always verify. And even with the secure by default and secure by design initiatives from Microsoft, there are still settings within all of the admin centers that you shouldn't be trusting and you should be changing them. So it's always really important to kind of even go in and have a look yourself. Of course, today I only have time to talk about 20 different admin tabs, but there's definitely many more different settings that you should be changing as well. So this specific option in here, this kind of forces a conscious data sharing decisions instead of just that accidental organization-wide leaks, for example, as well. So you can prevent that data exposure by setting just limited sharing capabilities. So how would you go about doing that? Well, within the SharePoint Admin Center, if you go over the policies, sharing, and then within the file and folder links options, if you just set it to specific people, so only the people that the user specifies, that will force the users to actually type in someone's email address or a group's email address of the people that they want to share a specific file or folder with. Okay, tip number 17 is to configure the idle session sign out on unmanaged devices. So all over social media, we always see those posts where someone at the airport left their laptop unlocked or whatever, and just people walk away from those devices. So this specific setting mitigates that. So this is only going to control access on unmanaged devices. So think about the use of BYOD for your full-time employees, but also your contractors, your guests, and so on. So ideally, you would want to automatically sign those users out after a period of inactivity. So if they're actively scrolling through or viewing documents, that's fine. But if they leave that option for a couple of minutes, or whatever it might be, and they're not actually doing anything, if they leave that tab open after a period of inactivity, you should be signing them out.
Just
So
a
how would you
reminder,
go
we have
about
10 minutes left.
Cool. So how would you go about doing that? Well, within policies and then access control within the SharePoint Admin Center, you can just click into the idle session sign out. And over here, you can just specify after what period of time users should be signed out. And then also you can give them a heads up. So give them a warning before they are signed out. Okay, on to the next one. So tip number 18 is to block communication from Teams trial tenants. So again, trial tenants can be created by anyone, including people that would have maybe a malicious intent. So some of them are being used for phishing, so you should be blocking them, right? So you can do that within the Teams Admin Center, and it is something that you can possibly use to prevent phishing attacks coming from those trial tenants. So if you jump into the Teams Admin Center, you go over to Users, External Access, and over here, if you scroll down and look at the people in my organization can communicate with accounts in trial Teams tenant, if you toggle that off, that will just fix that issue for you. Okay, tip number 19 is to require CAPTCHA for anonymous meeting joiners. So this specific setting would prevent bots from snooping on meetings. So I actually had a client coming up to me saying that they were in a meeting, they're not paying for the M365 Copilot license, so they had no options for transcription or anything like that, but they were meeting with an external organization who kind of recorded the meeting and also was using some kind of a tool to transcribe it. And they weren't really aware of that fact that they were using some third party to do it for them unless they got the meeting notes. And at the bottom of that email that they received, it was, transcription completed by blah, 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 the name of the third party tool. And then they asked that question, how did it happen? Well, this is possible. People can set it up because that option is again enabled by default for bots and malicious agents to kind of join without any additional verification checks. So how would you go about blocking that? Well, if you open up the Teams Admin Center, you expand the meetings from the navigation pane. Under meetings, you've got the meeting policies section. So either select an existing policy or create a new one. And within the meeting join and lobby sections, if you scroll down, you've got that require a verification check from. If you set it to anonymous users and people from untrusted organizations, that will make those bots or those unverified users go through a verification check where they need to match that CAPTCHA. Okay, and the last tip, and it's kind of very comprehensive one, but for someone that is very passionate about Purview, I couldn't help myself but also include it. So tip number 20 is to use the sensitivity labels and data loss prevention, including Power Platform DLP. So over here, basically you can classify, label, and apply different protections to your sensitive data. What is often overlooked is that people would have a very robust data security, data compliance structure within Microsoft Purview Admin Center, encrypted labels, very kind of strict data loss prevention policies. However, they forget about the fact that the Power Platform side of things is wide open, basically, and anyone can use a flow to exfiltrate data from within the organization. So again, for those of you that do not know, Purview is just that unified, very comprehensive set of tools to help you with your data compliance, data security, and data governance. Within Microsoft Purview, you've got that Microsoft Purview Information Protection, which is just one of the different solutions and product within it. And within Information Protection, you've got your sensitivity labels that can help you put that kind of digital stamp on a document, apply encryption, and make sure that unauthorized people cannot actually have access to that type of data. Data loss prevention within Purview is just another one of those solutions that blocks the accidental data leakage, right? But again, my point here is that people often forget to kind of look at the Power Platform data loss prevention, or what they call data policies within that specific admin center. So if you look at that hierarchy, within Purview, you've got information protection and data loss prevention, but then within the Power Platform itself, which is completely separate, you've got your data policies. So again, for someone that provides, I suppose, a lot of content around Purview, there are a lot of different resources that you would be able to find around labels or data loss prevention on my blog. So make sure that you go and check it out. Again, I won't be kind of diving into the labels or DLPs in here. Just wanted to show you where you would find those specific settings or how you would go about setting the map. However, I really want to bring your attention to that data policy within the Power Platform. So if you jump into the Power Platform Admin Center, security, data privacy, make sure that you go through the list of all the connectors where people can use to exfiltrate data to somewhere outside of the organization. Think about any cloud storage provider like Dropbox, but also agents within social media platforms like Meta, so Facebook, that kind of stuff. So again, I've attached some additional references and resources that you can use to kind of upskill on Purview or Power Platform and the data policies as well. So there's a lot of content that's really good out there, even outside of my own website and so on. So make sure that you go and check it out. So just to wrap it up, because I'm really conscious of the time. So in conclusion, use that defense in depth and zero trust approach. Again, there is no silver bullet solution here. So your foundation must be really strong before you can add your complex tools, right? Start with the basics. So think of MFA, device security, least privilege, so on, and then layers of those different protections coming from different admin centers, different types of configuration. So even if one fails, others will still hold the line for you. So again, kind of going back to that thing where I mentioned at the start that your tenant, this is essentially your castle or your fortress. So make sure that it is secured from all sides and all angles. So just a quick one. Thank you very much to our sponsors and to all the organizers. So thank you very much for having me. Make sure that you stay tuned for the next session on simplifying the data governance with Purview. If you've got any questions, just let me know in the chat, or you can catch me on my social media platforms. So I'll just leave that slide on just for a second so you can grab those links as well. But yeah, thanks everyone for staying until the end, and hope you have a fantastic day. I see some questions in the chat, so thanks, Parav. Users can download files. Okay, so I didn't specifically mention the fact that the users can download files identified as malicious by safe attachments in Microsoft Defender for Office 365. Yeah, it's hard to know why that would be a default behavior. Yeah, there is a SharePoint PowerShell that can remediate that. Yeah, so my photo would be similar to yours. So I mentioned that a couple of times that secure by default or secure by design, these initiatives from Microsoft are great, but they're not there yet. So you should always be kind of using your own consciousness and going through those settings, going through different admin centers and verifying whether you are actually agreeing with what those default settings are. So there are many, many other settings that I haven't even mentioned or haven't even touched on within this specific presentation, but you can kind of imagine the vast kind of extent of those settings that are not really secure that you should be definitely questioning. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So again, if you've got any questions or an afterthought after that, make sure that you can catch me on Twitter or X or LinkedIn, or just DM me on my website as well. But yeah, thank you very much. I'll just stop sharing. And you can guys probably get a chance to grab a coffee or grab a drink or something before the next session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Elvin. Thank you so much for your session. Appreciate it. Very helpful. All right.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.